Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. We're short of time. The chair will sort me out if we're not careful. That film was made by Ken Loach, the director. I want to thank Ken. Here he is. I want to thank him for his life of dedication to social justice. There are some unsung heroes I want to thank as well, and it's the Shadow Treasury team that have worked so hard over the last couple of years to make sure that we had a costed manifesto and make sure we're taking it to the Tories. And that's Peter Dowd as our Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Jonathan Reynolds, Annalise Dodds, and in the Lords, Dennis Tunnicliffe and Brian Davis. I want to say thanks to them for their hard work. But you know, I now have a brilliant parliamentary private secretary. Her name is Karen Lee. She won Lincoln back to us at the last general election. Thanks, Karen. This is a woman who wins the election, comes to Parliament, takes her seat as an MP. She's a nurse, realises they might be short at the local hospital, so goes back and does her shifts at the hospital. That's what I call the socialist. Only a few months ago, we were 24 points behind in the polls. Our opponents and virtually every political commentator, and those expressions are actually interchangeable, by the way, they predicted that we'd be wiped out in the general election. I said then, in interview after interview, that the polls would narrow and we would shock them all. Not many believed me. Some wondered what I was on. But let's be honest. Until you saw the exit polls, you were a bit edgy as well, weren't you? What I said then is before the election was once we entered the election period and broadcasters were legally obliged to give us some semblance of balanced coverage, we'd turn the polls round. Why? Why did I think that? Well, first, because people would be given the chance to see Jeremy Corbyn for what he is, what I know he is. The honest, principled, and yes, strong and determined person and leader that he really is. And second, because people would see in our manifesto what we really stood for and our vision of hope for our country. And you know, that's what's happened. But it's also down to you, our members, whose overwhelming enthusiasm inspired people in their millions to come out and vote for us. I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for what you did. Thank you. So yes, we've proved now that we're an effective campaigning party. We now have to prove that we'll be an effective governing party. A government that can set the political agenda for a generation. That's our objective. And you know, if you study history, the history of our party, you'll see it's always been the role of Labour governments to lead our country into each new era. It was the Attlee Labour government that built a new society from the debris of the bomb sites in the new era after the Second World War. Those men and women who had endured so much through the depression of the 1930s and who had sacrificed so much to defeat fascism placed their trust in us, in our party. My dad was a sergeant in the army, and my mum was a welder by day in a munitions factory and an ARP warden at night. God knows how she did it. But they came out of the war with that spirit of 1945, inspired in them by the election of a Labour government. And the Labour Party fulfilled its promise. They fulfilled its promise to them and all families by creating the welfare state, providing free education for their children, building a decent home, investing in the economy based upon full employment, and yes, creating that jewel in our crown, the NHS, the most civilising act of any government ever. And in the 1960s, when the Tories governed this country from their gentlemen's clubs on behalf of the privileged few and held this country back from facing the challenges of the modern era, it was the Wilson Labour government that recognised the potential of a modern Britain forged, as Harold Wilson said, in the white heat of the scientific revolution. For my brother and me, and so many others of our generation, new educational opportunities enabled us to challenge the barriers that held back so many working-class kids. It was down to a Labour government. And yes, in 1997, I remember it, after 18 years of Thatcherism, when whole industries and communities had been destroyed by the Tories, and when our public services were on their knees, it was the Blair-Brown governments that recognised and delivered the scale of public investment that a 21st century needed. We should never forget that we are part of a great Labour tradition, and we should be so proud of that. So as we now enter the new era, the next era, the era of the fourth industrial revolution, I tell you, it's a Corbyn Labour government that will rescue our country from austerity, and it will be up to us to lay the foundations of that new world that now awaits us. That new world is being shaped already by the beginnings of the fourth industrial revolution. Huge changes are underway in our society and in our economy. Technological change is accelerating. This year, Chinese scientists used quantum mechanics to teleport data to a satellite. We've beaten that. We can match that. We've beaten it. We have a whole Tory government teleported from the 18th century. We're determined that Britain embraces the possibilities of technological change, scary though that might be. By the middle of this century, it's possible that up to half of the jobs we now do could be automated away. The jobs that remain can, if we let them, be exploitative, dangerous, degrading, and dead-end. Or the jobs we create can provide good, secure employment in work that's fulfilling and meaningful in communities where pride and prosperity has been restored. We've already a foretaste of what this revolution would look like if it was left to the Tories. It's being used to vastly enrich a tiny elite whilst creating life for many workers of, well, you know, long hours, low pay, and insecure unemployment. So there's a choice to be made. We can remain a low-wage economy, specialising in zero-hour contracts, or we can use the state to help shape Britain's future in this new world. We know it can be done. You know, as the Tories waste time and energy alienating our closest trading partners, other countries are using state direction of innovation and investment to carve out vital areas of expertise in robotics, in electronic cars, in clean tech, in the smart city. But though the technologies are new, the British problem is old. The city is not channeling investment into high-value, high-productivity businesses. Instead, it's channeling investment into property speculation, often owned by overseas speculators. It's the rentier economy, where wealth is secured not by what you produce, but the amount of rent you can charge. So we'll change that. We'll put taxpayers' money into key research projects. We'll foster the creation of networks and clusters of expertise. We say to the technology sector and the universities, help is on the way. So to reconnect the financial sector to the economy of research and development and production will transform our financial system. Labour will establish a strategic investment board comprising the Chancellor, Becky Long-Bailey, the Secretary of State for Business, one of the stars of our new generation, and will also include the Governor of the Bank of England to coordinate the promotion of investment and employment and real wages. But in our investment strategy, let's make it clear, we will no longer accept the disparities between investment in London, the home counties, and the rest of the country. This Tory government plans to invest in the north just 1/5 of what it will spend on transport per head in London. We'll legislate for a fair distribution of investment. We'll devolve decision-making through regional development banks, our mayors, and regenerate the powers and resources available again to local government and our local councils. We'll build Crossrail for the north, connecting the great northern cities from west coast to east, and yes, we'll extend HS2 into Scotland and invest in rail all across the country overall. We'll deliver the funding for Midlands Connect, overhauling transport across the Midlands. And we'll overturn decades of neglect and lack of investment in the South West by electrifying. I tell you, at long last, we'll electrify the railway lines from Cornwall right through to London once and for all. And you know, the storms and flooding in recent months are yet another environmental wake-up call. This country has huge natural renewable resources, and we have an immense heritage of scientific and engineering experience. Yet this government has slashed the funding to the renewables industry that needs to get on its feet. We'll ensure we become world leaders in decarbonising our economy. And we'll do it partly through a publicly owned energy supply based upon alternative energy sources. Where the Tories have dithered and delayed to deliver zero-carbon electricity, we'll absolutely commit, for example, to building projects like the Swansea Tidal Lagoon. So, ours will only become an economy for the many if we significantly broaden ownership. That means, yes, supporting entrepreneurs, small businesses, the genuinely self-employed, and massively expanding worker control and the cooperative sector on a scale we've never seen before in this country. You know, building an economy for the many also means bringing ownership and control of the utilities and key services into the hands of the people who use them and work in them. So yes, I want people to have no doubt. Rail, water, energy, Royal Mail, we're taking them back. We can't allow this dynamic vision for our economy to be undermined by the combination of, well, belligerence and incompetence displayed by the Tories in the current EU negotiations. Our aim, yes, is to create a Britain for the many, not the few. But our conscience doesn't end at the English Channel. We want a Europe for the many, not the few. That's why, yes, whilst respecting the referendum decision, we'll work with our partners across Europe to create a European future based upon collaboration and cooperation. But I tell you, we start with the first step. We start with addressing the brutal treatment of EU citizens by this government. We demand that the rights of EU citizens in this country are fully protected, just as we wish the rights of UK citizens in other EU countries to be protected as well. And I want to warn the Tories. I want to warn them. If they try to water down or undermine the protections we've secured on employment, consumer or environmental rights, we'll give them the political battle of their lives. As we go into government, you know, we'll have to clear up the mess the Tories have left us. And after long years of austerity, the Tories are leaving a society steeped in debt and scarred by low pay and insecurity, with our public services, well, we've heard, in meltdown. Well, we will commission a review of the scale and causes and responses to debt. That's true. But action is needed fast. So first, what we'll do is what the Tories have failed to do. We in government will bring down the government's deficit and will take and control the debt. The Tories have borrowed, let's be clear, the Tories have borrowed more than any Labour government ever. On arrival in office, we'll set out plans to eliminate the deficit and reduce the debt based upon our fiscal credibility rule. For each policy in our manifesto, we're preparing detailed implementation plans. But to pay for those public services, let's just be straight with people. To pay for those public services, we'll close the tax loopholes and the tax avoidance scams by the mega-rich. And we're not asking for the earth. We simply want to make sure the rich and the corporations pay their way. Many people are also forced into debt by low wages. It cannot be right that we are the only major developed economy to have grown while wages are lower than they were before the crash 10 years ago. And as inflation hits, many workers are facing yet another real terms cut in their pay. And what's interesting, at the same time, the pay of the FTSE 100 chief executives is 160 times that of the average worker. In the election campaign, Theresa May was asked, why were nurses being forced to resort to food banks? And she replied, the issue is complex. It isn't complex, it's simple. They're simply not being paid enough. That's why we insist the pay cap is scrapped once and for all, and not just for some, but for everybody. And we demand decent wages for all workers. Yes, Britain does deserve a pay rise now. And we will introduce, yes, the £10 real living wage, £10 an hour. We'll introduce pay ratios at the top. And I promise this, We will address the gender pay gap that still leaves women's wages trailing 14% behind men. Every piece of legislation that we introduce will be measured against its impact on women before implementation when we go into government. I've been really pleased and proud to support a number of brave people throughout the summer who've been on picket lines campaigning for decent pay. And I've been particularly proud of those young people who've been campaigning for decent wages now. Those who've joined the Bakers Union to take on the might of McDonnell's. And here's one of them. And Sue. Be clear, when we go into government, we'll restore basic employment rights, we'll repeal the Trade Union Tory Act, the Trade Union Act the Tories introduced, we'll set up a new Ministry of Labour, and we will restore free collective bargaining into our country again. As wages have fallen behind, more and more families have been pushed into debt, deeper into debt for many. Household debt in this country stands at a record £1.8 trillion. We've seen with payday loans, some companies were making massive profits from people's financial difficulties. Under Labour pressure, it was Labour pressure, the government was forced to cap interest payments on payday loans. But more than 3 million credit card holders are trapped by their debt. They've paid more in interest charges and fees than they originally borrowed. Now, the Financial Conduct Authorities argue for action to be taken on credit card debt, as on payday loans. So I'm calling upon the government to act now and apply the same rules on payday loans to credit card debt. It means that no one will ever pay more in interest than their original loan. If the Tories refuse to act, I can announce today that the next Labour government will amend the law. When we go in, you can call it the McDonnell Amendment. Sorry, I couldn't help myself on that one. Jeremy's told me no jokes, but I couldn't resist it. Okay, look, we know some of the heaviest burden of debt has fallen on young people. We know that, don't we? The Tories tripled tuition fees, and they allowed the Students' Loan Company to hike up interest charges. Young people are now leaving university with £57,000 worth of debt. That's why we put forward in our manifesto our fully costed commitment to scrap tuition fees. And we will. And we will. I say it time and time again, education is a gift from one generation to another. It's not a commodity to be sold. The Tories, with the connivance of the Lib Dems, have created a totally unsustainable situation. 3/4 of our students will never fully repay their loan. So it's not just bad for students, it's a bad deal for the taxpayer too. So as a result of Labour pressure, the government, even this government now, as we hear, is considering maybe reducing interest rates or raising repayment thresholds. And that's what they're being forced to consider at the moment. I tell you, if they bring forward effective proposals, we'll support them, but that won't go nearly far enough. We cannot afford another 5 years of spiralling student debt. According to the Institute of Fiscal Studies and our own independent research, writing off the Tories' student debt now would cost about £10 billion by 2050. Waiting until 2022 could treble the cost of a write-off. So I'm calling upon the Chancellor to act now before the situation becomes unmanageable. It's the Tories who got young people into this mess. They should take some responsibility for getting these young people out of it. But it's not just students and households with credit cards who are being ripped off. The scandal of the Private Finance Initiative, launched by John Major, has resulted in huge long-term costs for taxpayers, whilst handing out enormous profits for some companies. Profits which are coming out of the budgets of our public services. Over the next few decades, nearly £200 billion is scheduled to be paid out of public sector budgets in PFI deals. In the NHS alone, £830 million in pre-tax profits have been made over the last 6 years. As early as 2002, this conference expressed its regret at the use of PFI. Jeremy Corbyn has made it clear that under his leadership, never again will this waste of taxpayers' money be used to subsidise the profits of shareholders. And you know, many of those companies and shareholders are based in offshore tax havens. The government could intervene immediately to ensure that companies in tax havens can't own shares in PFI companies and their profits aren't hidden from HMRC. So let me give you this commitment. We'll put an end to this scandal and we'll reduce the costs to the taxpayers. How? Well, we've already pledged that there will be no new PFI deals signed by us in government, but we'll go further. And I can tell you today, it's what you've been calling for. We'll bring existing PFI contracts back in-house. We're bringing them back. We're bringing them back. Over the last 7 years, the Tories have tried to change people's views of what's normal and acceptable in our society. They want us to accept, in the 5th richest country in the world, it's normal and acceptable for people to be saddled with debt, for people to have to work long, often insecure hours, stressed out, struggling to find time to be with their family, for people not to have a pay rise for years, no matter how hard you work or how dedicated you are, for young people to have no prospect of owning their own home, for disabled people to be pushed to the edge by the benefit system, or for carers to be struggling without support or recognition. Let's make it clear. We will never accept that this is normal or acceptable in our society. Never. Yes. Yes, we'll increase GDP, we'll close the current account deficit, and we'll increase productivity. But life is not just about statistics, is it? Bobby Kennedy said 50 years ago, the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry. The performance of our government will be measured by the care we show to all people and the richness, the full richness of their lives. That's how we wish to be judged. We proved in the election, and we will now go on to prove in government, our belief that hope will always overcome fear, that kindness and generosity will always overcome greedy self-interest, that the flame of solidarity in our society will never be extinguished. For years, we've campaigned and proclaimed that another world is possible. I tell you now, that world is not just possible, it's in sight. Let's create it now together. Solidarity.